The rain began as a rumor against the city's neon, a fine, slick whisper that made the pavement shine like a mirror and blur the edges of everything people pretended to understand about one another. Inside the downtown hotel ballroom the company band had long since given up, the leftover laughter spilling into the corridors like stray light. He was one of the last men standing near the coat check, a single father with grease under his nails from a night double-shifting at the diner, and a suit borrowed from a neighbor because his own jacket still smelled of coffee. His name was Marcus. His arms still bore the soft, familiar ache of carrying 3-year-old Jalen through bath time and bedtime stories earlier that morning, an aching that tasted like responsibility and stubborn love. Somewhere between the awkward applause for another colleague's toast and the clink of glass on glass, his boss, Cynthia Lang, smiled too broadly and turned her night into a stumble. She was a kind of executive whose name had been printed at the top of memos, and whose decisions had the weight of months. She was also the kind of woman who, after too many drinks, surrendered a private softness that rarely met the light. When she left the ballroom, stumbling toward the valet, someone else reached for the steering keys and found them cold and immovable. She was clearly unfit to go alone. Marcus watched the scene with a complicated mix of duty and dread. He had driven Cynthia home once before on company business, a quick drop-off in a late shift, but never like this. Never in the middle of the night with rain painting halos around the streetlights and the world narrowing to the space between the parking garage and the back seat of his compact car. He felt a gaze from acquaintances, 1,000 small judgments that loved to collect at company parties, the neat arch assumptions about class and race, and whose labor exists to tidy the mess of the powerful. When Cynthia's assistant murmured something about an Uber that had mysteriously vanished, Marcus offered the one thing he had always offered others in need: his 2 hands and a key. He had no intention of becoming anyone's hero. He had intentions of getting home before dawn to build a fort of blankets and to find the small, prop body of his son. He had a plan, a promise, and a tired, patient heart. He didn't know, then, what Waking would look like for Cynthia. He didn't know whether gratitude or scorn would greet him. He didn't know that a single night would unspool into a reckoning that would test the fragile architecture of his dignity, his job, and his longing for a life in which his son could grow up not learning to lower his eyes first. All he knew was the quiet hiss of rain on the windshield and the steady, careful way he guided the steering wheel, as if every rotation could steer them both towards something softer than the world had been that day. Marcus had learned to live in the interstices between what the world expected and what his life truly required. He had been that child once, the one who watched his mother fold herself into shift after shift, who learned to measure time by the tick of a second hand on an old wall clock and by the small rituals that kept hunger at bay. He had been the kid who understood that dignity could be stitched together out of small, persistent acts, showing up for school even when the laundry wasn't finished, handing in homework even when the brain felt too tired to shape the letters. Those lessons had become his creed by the time he was 27, a single father who took 2 jobs, not for prestige, but for the sound of his son's laugh and the safety of a roof. On weekdays, he worked at the diner from dawn until the lunch rush eased, turning bacon and warming toast with the kind of practiced tenderness that made regulars return. Afternoons found him at the logistics company, where he had risen from loader to driver to a respected mid-level role by sheer reliability. Cynthia Lang was a kind of boss whose presence was a weather pattern. Her decisions altered the office climate, and her compliment or dismissal spread in equal measure. She had once spoken to Marcus about efficiency in a way that felt like instruction from a distant country. She had never once asked about Jalen or how Marcus managed 2 jobs and a child's small, urgent world. Marcus's apartment was 3 stories up and sandwiched between a nail salon and a shuttered convenience store. It was modest and warm, full of mismatched furniture and handmade drawings plastered to the refrigerator door, Jalen's universe in crayon. The nursery corner doubled as a study nook. A stack of second-hand parenting books leaned against a cactus in a chipped terracotta pot. His son's favorite stuff line, already threadbare, held the top of the pile like a small, patient monarch. This was not a story of squalor or tragedy. It was a story of quiet determination. Marcus was neither victim nor saint, only a man balancing on the thin rope of responsibility. At the company, Marcus was known as competent, reliable, invisible in a way that people who do the work rarely are. He took orders and executed them with the attention of someone who believed that dignity is revealed in the act of showing up. Yet, his existence coexisted uncomfortably with the office's power matrix. There were jokes that landed like small splinters, comments whispered just loud enough to be heard by the right ears. Cynthia had presided over budgets and promotions, and she had made choices that kept people like Marcus tethered to the bottom rungs. Her decisions had sometimes felt like a closing fist, efficient and certain. The company holiday party had been a pageant of contradictions. Expensive hors d'oeuvres next to time cards, laughter thin with nerves. Marcus had gone reluctantly, tore between the evening shift and the need to maintain good standing at work, to show the face of someone who was reliable. He had not planned to drink. He had planned to be invisible and polite, to move like a shadow through the rooms where leadership collected, to accept the soft dismissal reserved for people who were necessary but unremarked upon. Cynthia had arrived in a silk dress that reflected light, like a piece of moonlight trapped in fabric. She had given speeches that snapped like paper and handshakes that felt practiced. She was the kind of person who made policies that reshaped people's lives without ever having to balance a diaper or keep a child awake at night. Her life and Marcus's had intersected for work, and that intersection had always been functional, never intimate. She had his job title on a file and his income on a payroll spreadsheet, but she had never been given the map of his heart. The night had folded into itself, and the bar had thinned to a scattering of figures. Cynthia laughed too loud and leaned too heavily on her assistant. It was obvious to anyone paying attention that she would not make it home alone. Marcus noticed because he had a peculiar radar for other people's missteps, honed by years of watching the world's indifference to those who faltered. He could have looked away. He could have waited until an Uber appeared or until someone else offered. Instead, he moved toward the car with a courtesy that was part instinct, part the simple, stubborn rule that you help a person who cannot help themselves. He drove cautiously, the rain making halos around the streetlights and the city feeling large in themselves but smaller than the choices made inside it. When he pulled up at Cynthia's address, the building announced power. Concierge, marble foyer, security cameras that watched like indifferent gods. He carried her keys with strange tenderness, the way handoff rituals carry a kind of consent and consequence. He tucked her shoes out from under the seat and watched her sleep, like a person not yet certain whether the moment required care or caution. He left the hall light on, took off his jacket, and in the quiet that rounded itself between the elevator ding and the soft whump of the bedroom door, Marcus thought about the small hours of morning and the sound of the sun calling Daddy. He did not expect to be remembered beyond the courtesy of a text message. He did not expect the nights and weeks to fold into a confrontation that would force the company to look at itself in a mirror. He went home thinking only of a son's small hand and a promise to be there for breakfast. He had no notion that his night would become a flashpoint, a lens through which power and prejudice, kindness and humiliation would be examined in public and private ways he could not yet imagine. Morning came with the smell of coffee and the small, constant negotiation of a life being lived on its own terms. Marcus made pancakes and scrambled eggs with the calm precision of practice, his son chattering about a cartoon adventure as if the world had not shifted overnight. Marcus's hands moved as if on autopilot, but his mind kept returning to the ballroom and the soft weight of Cynthia's unconscious form against the backseat headrest. He had thought it was a simple human courtesy. He had not anticipated the way simple acts of care can be read, rewritten, and weaponized by the narratives people prefer. The first ripple came from the company's group chat, a blurry photograph of Cynthia asleep with her head leaning against the car window, a caption that was meant to be funny and finished with a mocking emoji. Marcus's stomach dropped. The picture had been taken without permission and circulated like a secret torn to ribbons. There was humiliation baked into that image, a small, private cruelty broadcast in the daytime like a stunt. 1,000 tiny judgments gathered like storm clouds. Why was he there? How had he been allowed to touch the boss's life? The comments were a mix of mockery and speculation, and they sliced into Marcus's privacy with the bluntness of a blade. It escalated as office gossip always does, fed by innuendo and the human hunger for drama. Someone suggested he had tried something untoward. Someone else implied an impropriety born of desire rather than decency. The story bent toward a version that fit pre-existing biases about race and class. Marcus found himself resisting the urge to explain, to defend the shape of what had been nothing more than a man driving a woman home because she could not stand. He had learned the long and lonely lesson that explanations rarely repair reputation. Once it has been set adrift by rumor, then the email arrived. Cynthia, in a rare show of vulnerability, had sent a short, formal message to the executive team about the party and expressed gratitude for help that had been rendered. She had written about being exhausted, about trusting the kindness of a colleague. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself relief. Maybe decency would shine through. Maybe the truth would settle like dust after a storm. But relief evaporated when the public version of the story unfurled. An influential trade blog picked up the photograph and spun a narrative that felt designed to provoke. The picture circulated with a headline that widened the schism between perception and truth. Social media fed the spark with cruel ridges, and an undercurrent of racist assumptions collected in the comments like barnacles. Marcus's name, once only a payroll entry, flickered on screens in contexts he had not consented to. People who had never met him made statements about his character based on an image that stole context and replaced it with fantasy. Marcus walked into the office and felt the air in a different shape. Some co-workers avoided his gaze. Others offered platitudes that felt like bandages over an open wound. A few older colleagues muttered things that harked back to a longer history of casual prejudice. Jokes about boundaries. Comments that suggested people like him should know his place. Marcus absorbed it all with the patient fatigue of someone who had long been rehearsed for this kind of diminishment. He had taught himself to keep standing straight, even when the world tried to bend him. The company's leadership convened a meeting, the kind that arrived with formal invites and the undertow of performance. Cynthia's statement had been sincere. She had thanked Marcus publicly for ensuring her safety that night. But sincerity and spectacle are not the same thing. The board's response read like a careful legal script. An internal review would be launched, policies would be revisited, and sensitivity training would be offered. Those words sounded like wind in a hollow room. Marcus recognized the pattern. Institutions often move toward procedure instead of justice. He allowed his suspicion, but tried to believe that truth had a way of asserting itself eventually. Meanwhile, the viral nature of the image gave rise to 1,000 private assaults. Marcus received anonymous messages at his personal number. His son's daycare faced awkward questions from other parents who had seen the photograph. He tried to shield Jalen from the waves of speculation, but the ripples reached further than he had imagined. A client threatened to pull a contract if the company did not act. Someone somewhere thought it appropriate to editorialize on the morality of a black man helping a white executive. As if decency itself had a color. Rumors metastasized when an influential coworker, a junior manager with ambition, and a predilection for gossip, leaked a version of events that painted Marcus as opportunistic. It was a small betrayal that carried the weight of historical stereotypes. Marcus felt the strain of being made into a symbol he had not chosen, a caricature on which people projected their own fears and assumptions. He had, at that point, already spent years carefully carving out an honest life for his son, and now that work required a different kind of defense. The stress began to show in small ways. Marcus double-checked his route home 3 times a day, aware of how eyes might track him. He replayed the night in his head, like a film he could not stop fast-forwarding through. He lost sleep not because of fear for his own body, but because he felt the weight of possible consequences that could derail the fragile scaffolding of his life. If his job was threatened, how would he provide? If his reputation was tarnished, how would his son understand the world? Amid the growing storm, a faction of colleagues chose compassion. A few offered quiet words. She had asked for help. They reminded others, and people like Marcus deserve respect. Some women in the office spoke up about Cynthia's tendency to push herself until she faltered. Those small voices mattered, like reeds offering resistance against a flood. Marcus clung to them as evidence that truth was not entirely drowned. Then the day came when Cynthia walked into the office after several days off, her face a canvas of contrition and exhaustion. She requested a private conversation with Marcus. The request itself was a tremor, a folding in of 2 lives that had been separated by company hierarchy and unspoken rules. Marcus agreed, not because he sought drama, but because the silence had become a pressure that demanded release. They met in a small conference room, corporate glass and synthetic leather, enclosing a world that demanded a tidy narrative. Marcus braced himself for whatever she would say, for possibility that gratitude could be performed or weaponized. Cynthia's words were a small, awkward apology followed by an earnestness that made Marcus aware of the fragile place where public image and private morality meet. She expressed regret for how the photo had been shared, for the indignity it caused. She acknowledged that stereotypes had been activated and pledged to use her influence to redirect the narrative. It was not an epic speech. It was human, clumsy, sincere. She offered a public statement to reclaim the truth and suggested changes to company policy to respect employee privacy and dignity. Marcus listened. He wanted to trust the movement toward repair. He had long believed in the possibility of change. But the world had taught him to be cautious when words were spoken in rooms watched by cameras. This was a test of character for both of them. For Cynthia, whether her contrition would translate into structural change. For Marcus, whether he would allow the moment to be reduced to performance. There were moments in life when the smallest choices had the largest resonance. This was one of them. The company did produce a statement. Cynthia's public note of thanks and apology appeared on the corporate intranet, and then, in a brief press release, it was polished, intentional, and intended to close the loop. The statement highlighted Marcus's kindness and condemned the unauthorized dissemination of the photograph. It promised an internal review and a renewed commitment to employee dignity. On paper, the matter seemed resolved. In the messy world outside, people are rarely satisfied with neatly tied bows. An investigative journalist at a local paper, hungry for a narrative that cut into the cultural seams, took an interest. The story's framing mattered. The journalist wanted to explore the intersection of race, class, and power inside the company, and he wanted to interview people who might illuminate those dynamics. Marcus was cautious, but agreed to meet on the condition that his story would be told accurately. He wanted the truth, not spectacle. He wanted to show the quotidian care that governed his life. The bedtime stories, the drives to school, the small acts that built his son's days. When the profile ran, it pulled at the edges of the story like a rending seam. The journalist had written with empathy, and the piece humanized Marcus in a way that helped reframe the image that had once been used to shame him. Readers responded with a swell of support. Some sent messages offering help. Some apologized for their earlier judgment. Some shared their own stories of being misread. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like truth might be enough to steady the narrative. But the pushback arrived with the concentrated force of something that cannot be easily erased. A prominent conservative blogger sees a photograph and reframed the narrative as a display of bias, a demonstration of how corporate America had become permissive. He suggested that Marcus had used the occasion to manipulate power. The comment section, as always, turned into a theater of cruelty where history and humanity were reduced to slogans. Racist innuendos returned, thinly veiled as concern for propriety. Marcus watched as his life became a prop in larger cultural fights. The pressure on Cynthia intensified in a different direction. Some within the company demanded that she publicly recant the interview and distance herself from Marcus to avoid the appearance of impropriety. Others rallied to her defense and argued for a more humane, contextual reading of a night. The board convened for another meeting that felt less like adjudication and more like performance to assure stakeholders. Corporate decisions were no longer only about profit margins. They were about optics, about the shifting currents of public sentiment. Marcus felt the ground shake under him. He began to receive veiled threats, anonymous letters, and emails filled with rancor. He found a smear campaign being quietly built to discredit him in case the optics required such a thing. The old patterns of history have long looked for ways to reinstate old hierarchies. When confronted with an image that challenged prevailing narratives, those forces often fell back on their most familiar scripts. Marcus realized that he had become a fulcrum in a conflict far larger than a single photograph. Then came the moment that would cut into the company's conscience like a scalpel. An internal whistleblower released a cache of emails that painted a different picture of the office culture, a pattern of dismissive comments toward lower-level employees, of decisions that favored culture of exclusivity. The documents revealed a culture that had tolerated small cruelties and encouraged a hierarchy of voices. The release of the emails changed the tenor of public sentiment. The conversation shifted from whether Marcus had done something improper to why the company had allowed a climate that made such an attack possible. Cynthia found herself caught between the weight of accountability and the reality of her own complicity. She had never intended harm, but intention is not the same as impact. The revelation forced her to reckon with how her leadership had, sometimes unknowingly, fostered an environment where someone's private photograph could be used as a weapon. It was a sobering moment that demanded a genuine response. The board had no choice but to act with more than statements. They instituted structural changes, launched mandatory trainings that included voices from outside the company, and appointed an independent investigator to look into patterns of behavior. Marcus watched these turns with a mix of indication and wariness. He had no appetite for being a celebrity of grievance. He wanted stability for his son. Seeing policies change did not erase the nights of worry or the sting of being reduced to a rumor. It did, however, signal that the system could be pressed to reflect humanity. He started to feel a fragile hope, a sense that perhaps institutions could be nudged to do better when confronted with truth. Yet the emotional core of the climax arrived not in courtrooms or press releases, but in a scene quieter and more intimate. Cynthia, in a moment of raw honesty, asked Marcus to speak at a company town hall. The request felt dangerous in the way of any moment where private pain meets public vulnerability. Marcus hesitated because he understood the stakes. Speaking could either humanize the issue further or open him to renewed attack. He agreed because his silence had already been twisted, and because he believed that his son might one day need to hear that a man had stood up and spoken for dignity. On the day of the town hall, the auditorium hummed with anticipation and a brittle tension. Camera phones glittered like constellation points in the dark. Marcus walked on stage with his son at his side. The small hand is a tether to everything that mattered. He had rehearsed nothing. Rehearsals felt small in the face of truth. He spoke plainly about the night, about what it had meant to him to ensure someone's safety, about the ways prejudice can distort a single act of care. He spoke about Jalen and about bedtime stories and about the fierce, ordinary love that had always guided him. As he spoke, the room shifted. People who had been ready to settle into their own predetermined judgments found themselves listening to a human voice that refused to be flattened into a stereotype. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. Colleagues who had been quiet now nodded, some with faces softened by shame, others by recognition. The speech did not end the argument, nor did it erase the uglier corners of culture, but it changed the conversation's center of gravity. Marcus's words became a mirror for the company to see itself as more than balance sheets and PR statements. They invited empathy where there had been reflexive dismissal. That moment, raw and unscripted, was the story's fulcrum. It forced people inside and outside the company to reckon with the ways a single assumption can metastasize. It made visible the violence of rumor and the possibility of structural repair. For Marcus, it was an act of courage that had nothing to do with bravado and everything to do with the quiet upkeep of dignity. For Cynthia, it was a confrontation with the limitations of power when it is not coupled with responsibility. For the company, it was a chance, perhaps the first real one, to do the work of change. After the town hall, the company moved with an anxious deliberateness. Policies were revised and rewritten, not as lip service, but as documents signed with intention. An independent ombudsman was appointed to handle complaints, and privacy protocols were tightened, small changes that had the potential to reshape the experience of many employees. Cynthia instituted a regular forum where lower-tier employees could speak to leadership without fear of repercussions. It was not a cure-all. Structural change rarely is. But for Marcus, watching the institution finally do the labor it had previously only performed in performative gestures felt like a small redemption. Life at home resumed its rhythm, though it now existed under a different light. Jalen continued to do his bedtime rituals with the same fierce tenderness. The lion, the story about the astronaut, the song that always began on the same note. Marcus resumed his double shifts with an even steadier patience, his work powered by a quiet, renewed belief that the world could sometimes tilt toward decency. He did not become a celebrity, nor did he expect to. The social storms calmed, and the smear campaigns dwindled under the light of more honest scrutiny. The company's changes did not come without detractors. Some complained of overreach. Others treated the reforms as inconvenience. A few influential voices in the industry judged the company's actions to be performative. Yet the most important voices were those who felt differently in their daily routines. Employees who began to feel safer, who found in new channels of permission to speak and be heard. Small things accrued: a cleaner, friendlier break room culture, younger employees taking comfort in the knowledge that grievance procedures would be handled by an independent third party. Cynthia's transformation was not a lightning stroke. It was incremental, messy, and real. She began attending community events and listening sessions, and the encounter with Marcus remained the hinge on which her change turned. She met with other leaders and admitted her blind spots in ways that sometimes felt clumsy but were nevertheless honest. The financial press noticed the company's renewed image, and, eventually, the client appreciated the institution's willingness to reckon. But beyond profit margins, the most notable effect was personal. Cynthia began to see leadership not as dominion, but as stewardship. It was a mundane, human shift that reverberated in the small decisions she made thereafter. Marcus's life gained a different kind of visibility. People who had once dismissed him began to greet him in the hallways with recognition rather than indifference. Some apologized. Others offered small gestures of support. Still, the most meaningful change was a lesson Jalen absorbed. He watched his father navigate humiliation and a system that could be cruel, and he watched him continue to act with quiet integrity. Those lessons were not lectures but lived examples. A curriculum of dignity passed from father to son in tiny rituals of care. Months later, a small foundation approached Marcus about partnering on a community program to mentor young black men in the city. They wanted his help because they had heard his story, not as spectacle, but as a model for resilience in the face of systemic insults. Marcus accepted, not out of desire for recognition, but because he believed in the work, helping young men see that their dignity was not negotiable. The program was modest, held in a community center with folding chairs and donated textbooks. It was precisely the kind of grassroots change that feels, in the end, like a reweaving of frayed social fabric. There were personal reckonings. 2. Marcus and Cynthia, by the time the year closed, had cultivated a respect that was new and difficult for both of them. They did not become friends in conventional sense, but they cultivated a working relationship laced with accountability. Cynthia's hand in restructuring policy involved Marcus's perspective in a meaningful way. The company listened. The gestures of inclusion were not always perfect, but they were honest attempts to redistribute power away from its old, harmful concentrations. The broader ripples of the incident were even more telling. Industry publications began to publish op-eds about privacy and dignity, citing the company as a case study in the cost of neglecting employee concern. Conversations at other firms shifted. People began to think about the ways technology and casual cruelty can conspire to make a private act into public humiliation. The cultural conversation around responsibility, especially among those in positions of power, matured in small but significant ways. Marcus's life remained at its core the same: a father who made pancakes, a driver who navigated city streets, a man who carried his son through nights when monsters were imaginary and mornings when bills had to be paid. But the world around him had inched, painfully and imperfectly, toward a recognition that dignity cannot be delegated only to policy memos. It requires constant stewardship. Marcus's night driving a drunk colleague home had become a catalyst for change, not because he had sought glory, but because human decency had once again been placed in stark contrast with casual malice. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Marcus took Jalen to the park. They pushed the small swing until it reached a steady rhythm, the kind of arc that feels like permission to breathe. A neighbor waved. A co-worker from the company called out hello from a bench. Marcus watched his son climb the slide with a reckless confidence that made his chest lift. He thought of the year's tumult and felt grateful not because the battle had been won in every way, but because the small, stubborn light of integrity had held. When evening fell, Marcus tucked Jalen into bed and sat for a long moment, listening to his son's steady breath. He thought about the range of human behavior he had witnessed: cruelty and contrition, rumor and reform. He thought about how small acts, offering a ride, speaking in a town hall, changing a policy, can ripple into institutions and into lives. He felt, for a rare instant, as if the world had honored something essential,